So the reason some people believe that these agencies, government agencies, have too much power is that they have powers that the Constitution clearly wanted separated. We know from our reading of the Constitution in Articles 1, 2, and 3 that legislative powers and executive powers and judicial powers were meant to be separate powers held by separate agencies and separate parts of the government, not agencies, but separate parts of the government. But agencies, a creation of the Congress, have legislative powers and executive powers and judicial powers. So the legislative powers come because they can create rules, and those rules have the force of law, meaning when an agency chooses to create a rule, and they have to go through a process, they can't just create it arbitrarily, but if they create those rules through their process, those rules have the force of law, meaning they impact the lives of US citizens. Secondly, they have executive powers. Most of these agencies have their own enforcement arms. If you've ever been on Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management land, you've probably met a ranger or a BLM employee, and they have authority to come and enforce the rules that their agency has set forth. And finally, they have judicial powers, meaning they can adjudicate the rules. So if you think that the rule is wrong and you challenge those rules, you don't get to go to a regular court. Instead, you have to go to an agency court where the agency judge will decide whether or not the agency rule was broken. So some people say this is just way too much power. It's not completely unchecked, however. So before we go into how the powers are checked or the limitations on agency power, it's important to understand where they come from. So you have to recognize that these agencies' powers come because they were created by the legislature. And the legislature, who has the power to create law, has, in essence, created the agency to deal with that portion of the law. And then, through an enabling act, sometimes called an organic statute, but anyway, through the law they create that creates the agency and gives the agency authority, they also give the executive branch the authority to control the agency. So this is why these agencies have this authority in the first place, is because Congress had to create them and then give the authority to the executive branch. So here's how they're controlled. I just said that it's way too much power in many people's opinion. But each of the agencies, are controlled by the different branches of government in different ways. First of all, the executive branch usually gets to appoint the leader of the agency. You'll notice that each time there's a presidential election and the party of the president changes, they'll reappoint all of these leaders. So the leaders of the agencies are appointed by the executive branch, and not only are they appointed by the executive branch, but in many cases, not all, but in many cases, they also have to be approved or confirmed by the US Senate. Secondly, the executive branch has control over the money of the agency. They run the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, and they control the flow of money. And so if an agency gets way out of check, the executive branch could cut off their funding. The legislative branch, of course, they have control over the law that initially created the agency. So when they write that law, they can limit the power of the agency. They also have authority, and this is the legislature again, to write amendments or addendums to laws, so they can change the authority of the agency as it goes along. Finally, the judicial branch does get to hear claims that the agency overstepped its bounds. If you'll remember, I said that when you challenge an agency rule, you have to go to agency court, in essence. But you can appeal a ruling from an agency court into the federal appeals court system. So that power can be checked. Anyway, so I thought it'd be helpful to kind of consider how these agencies are created, the powers they have, and then how the different branches of the government are able to exercise a degree of control over the agencies.